In 1996, 9-year-old Burke Ramsey startled both police and psychologists with his eerie, calm, fleeting smiles and vague responses when questioned about his sister JonBenét's murder. At the time, he seemed too young to fully grasp the tragedy, but perhaps not as an adult. In later interviews, his cryptic silence and unsettling smirk raised haunting questions. What did Burke witness or do that night? The answer remains one of the most enduring mysteries of America's most baffling criminal case. One of the most pivotal moments in assessing Burke's psychological state occurred just weeks after the murder. On January 8, 1997, he was interviewed by Dr. Suzanne Bernard, a child psychologist at the Children's Advocacy Center in New Witt, Colorado. The session was recorded and designed to feel safe, incorporating playtime to put Burke at ease. But what unfolded was far from reassuring. When asked how he felt in the wake of his sister's violent death, Burke said he still felt safe in the very home where the crime occurred. An unsettling statement given the circumstances. Most children in similar situations display fear or cling to their parents, yet Burke seemed emotionally detached. Speaking about JonBenét, he offered flat responses such as, "I'm fine," or simply, "Yeah." When asked if he missed her, he didn't express sadness or fear. Instead, he said he coped by playing Nintendo, a behavior some experts interpret as emotional numbing, a psychological defense against trauma. A drawing exercise revealed even more. In a family portrait, Burke left JonBenét out entirely, placed his father far to the side, and drew his mother as the smallest figure. Such omissions, while speculative, are often examined by child psychologists as clues to emotional distance or underlying tension within the family. Perhaps most concerning was his reaction to questions about inappropriate physical contact. His demeanor shifted. He put a toy on his head, appeared visibly anxious, and admitted he had a secret he would not share. This moment, subtle but profound, left a lasting impression on Dr. Bernard. Though he made no explicit disclosure, his evasiveness hinted at something deeper and unspoken. These behavioral observations were later included in the controversial Bonita Papers, an unofficial compilation of investigative details, including Burke's interview. While the authenticity of the document has been debated, many investigators and analysts still reference it when exploring the psychological dimensions of the case. Taken together, his strange composure, emotional detachment, symbolic omissions in drawings, and evasive answers, Burke appeared untouched by the horror that had unfolded just steps away. Whether this reflected the innocence of childhood, the protective shield of trauma, or something more troubling remains one of the many unanswered questions surrounding JonBenét Ramsey's death. Nearly 2 decades later, Burke re-emerged in the public eye during a rare 3-part interview with Dr. Phil McGraw in September 2016. Unlike the 1997 session with Dr. Bernard, this was a candid, high-stakes, nationally televised conversation. It reignited debate over his potential role or knowledge in the still unsolved case. Statement analyst Mark McClish and behavioral consultant David Thompson closely studied Burke's words and body language. McClish noted Burke's use of uncertain language, such as, "I want to say," when recalling the last time he saw JonBenét alive, interpreting this tentativeness as a possible sign of hesitation, memory gaps, or even an unconscious desire to obscure the truth. Yet when asked if he had heard anything unusual on the night of the murder, Burke gave a firm no, which McClish believed was truthful, even if it didn't resolve the broader ambiguities in his account. When confronted with the question that had followed him for decades, "Did you kill your sister?" Burke did not offer a direct denial. Instead, he replied, "Look at the evidence, or the lack of it." To McClish, this kind of deflection was atypical for an innocent person, who would usually respond with an unequivocal no. Burke's demeanor further divided public opinion. Throughout the interview, he frequently smiled inappropriately, laughed nervously, and shifted in his seat, gestures many found unsettling. David Thompson, however, urged caution. In a detailed analysis, he argued that Burke's behavior might stem from anxiety or introversion rather than guilt. As a reclusive software engineer who worked from home, Burke may simply have lacked the social conditioning to navigate intense public scrutiny. Thompson compared him to Brendan Dassey from Making a Murderer, noting that socially awkward individuals are often misinterpreted when seen through a lens of suspicion. In the end, Burke's discomfort, inconsistent language, and emotional detachment did not provide clear evidence of wrongdoing, nor did they fully exonerate him. Instead, they added another layer of psychological complexity to a case already clouded by contradictions, media spectacle, and unresolved trauma. Experts remain divided. Dr. Suzanne Bernard, who interviewed Burke in 1997, described his unusual calm and sense of security despite the tragedy, interpreting them as possible signs of emotional dissociation or shock, a subconscious effort to detach from overwhelming trauma. McClish, focusing on Burke's 2016 language patterns, saw signs of possible concealment in his avoidance of direct denial. Thompson, in contrast, viewed Burke's nervous smiles and fidgeting as anxiety-driven and consistent with his reserved personality. The most controversial theory came from CBS's 2016 documentary, The Case of JonBenét Ramsey. Former FBI profiler Jim Clemente and behavioral analyst Laura Richards suggested that Burke, in a moment of childhood frustration, may have accidentally caused his sister's death during a dispute over a snack. They cited reports of behavioral problems, such as smearing feces on JonBenét's belongings, and hints of sibling rivalry as supporting factors. To this day, what Burke knows, or doesn't know, remains locked in silence, adding to the haunting enigma of JonBenét Ramsey's murder. The documentary put forward a theory of accidental manslaughter, followed by a family cover-up. Though widely criticized and later settled through a defamation lawsuit filed by Burke, the program nonetheless fueled public speculation and cast a lasting shadow over his public image. Taken together, these expert perspectives create a conflicted narrative. Burke's behaviors, his flat tone as a child, evasive language as an adult, and awkward smiles, can be interpreted in multiple ways, as coping mechanisms, as signs of social awkwardness, or as potential indicators of a deeper truth. No single explanation is definitive, yet the lack of resolution continues to raise questions about what Burke truly experienced on the night of December 26, 1996. Whether he was a traumatized boy shielding himself from unbearable pain or someone burdened by unspoken knowledge remains an unsettling uncertainty in one of America's most perplexing murder mysteries. Prior to JonBenét Ramsey's murder, several reports surfaced describing troubling behaviors exhibited by Burke. These accounts would later become focal points for both media coverage and forensic speculation. According to sources such as CBS Real Crime and testimony from the family's housekeeper, Linda Hoffman Pugh, Burke engaged in concerning behavior toward his younger sister. Among the most frequently cited incidents were repeated episodes of smearing feces on JonBenét's belongings, including her bedroom walls and bed. There was also a reported incident in which he struck her with a golf club, allegedly leaving a visible scar on her face. While such actions might seem like juvenile misbehavior, some experts interpreted them as possible signs of deeper psychological disturbance or unresolved emotional tension. Forensic pathologist Dr. Werner Spitz publicly pointed to these acts as potential manifestations of sibling rivalry, jealousy, or frustration, dynamics possibly intensified by pressures within the Ramsey household, particularly the attention JonBenét received from beauty pageants and the media. Although these behavioral red flags have been widely discussed, no formal psychological evaluation of Burke prior to 1996 has ever been made public. The absence of clinical documentation, leaves room for speculation, but also highlights the limitations of interpreting childhood behavior without full context. Critics argue that revisiting these incidents in the wake of a national tragedy risks amplifying their significance beyond what was understood at the time. Nevertheless, these early accounts remain part of the broader psychological profile that continues to influence theories about Burke's possible role in the case. Whether they were isolated, age-related outbursts, or early indicators of deeper issues remains unresolved, adding another layer of complexity to an already contradictory and uncertain story. The psychological analysis of Burke Ramsey, drawn from his behavior during interviews and interpreted by various experts, paints a portrait of ambiguity and complexity. His emotional detachment, unusual sense of safety after his sister's murder, and visible anxiety in high-pressure situations could reflect lingering trauma, or simply his inherent personality traits. Dr. Suzanne Bernard and statement analyst Mark McClish noted patterns that might suggest emotional suppression or even concealed knowledge shaped by dysfunctional family dynamics. Their observations hinted at the possibility that Burke was either protecting himself psychologically or withholding critical information. In contrast, behavioral specialist David Thompson urged caution, arguing that Burke's nervous laughter and discomfort should not automatically be read as signs of guilt. He placed these behaviors within the broader context of introversion and stress under extreme public scrutiny. Meanwhile, forensic psychiatrist Dr. Park Dietz and the CBS documentary The Case of JonBenét Ramsey suggested the broader possibility of intrafamilial involvement in the crime. However, neither provided definitive evidence tying Burke to the act itself. These theories, while provocative, remain speculative in the absence of conclusive proof. Importantly, no formal psychological diagnosis has ever confirmed that Burke suffers from any serious mental disorder. Ultimately, while his behavioral patterns have fueled decades of speculation, they remain inconclusive, blurred by the emotional trauma of the case and complicated by the limited availability of primary psychological data. In the end, Burke Ramsey's conduct raises more questions than answers. Whether his behavior reflects innocence overshadowed by tragedy or the weight of painful secrets, his role in America's most confounding child murder case remains elusive, part of a mystery still unresolved nearly 3 decades later. Could a 9-year-old kill? The murder of JonBenét Ramsey remains one of the most haunting and polarizing criminal mysteries in American history. On Christmas night in 1996, the 6-year-old beauty queen was found brutally murdered in the basement of her family's Boulder, Colorado home. The cause of death was determined to be asphyxiation from strangulation, accompanied by a severe skull fracture, details that only deepened the case's complexity. From the beginning, public fascination with the case was matched only by confusion. Nearly 30 years later, no official suspect has been charged, and theories continue to swirl, ranging from bizarre scenarios to deeply personal suspicions. At the center of several of these theories stands Burke Ramsey, JonBenét's older brother, who was 9 years old at the time of her death. Burke, along with his parents John and Patsy Ramsey, was in the house on the night JonBenét died. Although DNA evidence eventually cleared the family as suspects in 2008, Burke's name has never fully escaped public suspicion. A prominent alternate theory suggests that Burke may have accidentally or intentionally caused JonBenét's death during a moment of childhood aggression, possibly followed by a family cover-up. Though unproven and controversial, this idea continues to fuel debate and scrutiny. This psychological and behavioral review aims to examine the available facts and testimonies about Burke's actions and demeanor before, during, and after the murder. The goal is to evaluate, objectively, whether his behavior and the known evidence point toward guilt, innocence, or something far more complicated. Although Burke Ramsey has never been officially named a suspect, he has remained a central figure in public speculation for decades. Present in the house on the night of the crime, Burke was part of the small group of people known to have been inside when JonBenét was killed. Her body was discovered in the basement with signs of strangulation and blunt force trauma. While no forensic evidence, such as fingerprints or DNA, linked Burke to the nylon cord or the broken paintbrush used in the murder, the absence of foreign footprints in the snow outside led some to believe the perpetrator must have already been inside the home. This intensified scrutiny on the Ramsey family, and particularly on Burke. A controversial theory featured in the 2016 CBS documentary suggested that Burke may have struck JonBenét with a flashlight during a dispute, possibly over a late-night snack. A forensic experiment in the documentary demonstrated that a child of Burke's age could have delivered a blow consistent with JonBenét's head injury. However, the flashlight was wiped clean of fingerprints, and no physical evidence tied Burke to it. Similarly, the ransom note left at the scene, though not linked to Burke by handwriting or fingerprints, aroused suspicion because of its unusual length and the specific demand for $118,000, an amount matching John Ramsey's Christmas bonus. Some theorists interpreted the note as an attempt to cover up a domestic incident, though no direct evidence connects Burke to its creation. Another point of contention came from analysis of the 911 call made by Patsy Ramsey. While she claimed Burke had been asleep throughout the night, enhanced audio of the recording reportedly captured a child's voice, possibly Burke's, in the background. If accurate, this would contradict the family's timeline and suggest Burke may have been awake and aware of the situation earlier than reported. These findings, however, were never officially validated in court. In the days and weeks following the murder, Burke was interviewed multiple times by law enforcement and a child psychologist. Available reports indicate that he was consistent in his statements and did not display clear signs of deception. At the time, psychologists concluded that the Ramsey household generally exhibited healthy family dynamics. However, decades later, Burke's 2016 televised interview with Dr. Phil reignited public controversy. His unusual facial expressions, nervous laughter, and emotionally flat responses led many viewers to question his credibility. Some experts interpreted his behavior as signs of anxiety or social discomfort rather than guilt, while others viewed it as evasive or emotionally detached. The CBS documentary's suggestion that Burke may have killed JonBenét either intentionally or accidentally was strongly denied by the Ramsey family. In response, Burke filed a defamation lawsuit against CBS, which was settled out of court in 2019. While the settlement did not assign legal fault, it showed the family's readiness to aggressively challenge any claims linking Burke to the crime. To evaluate the likelihood of Burke's involvement in JonBenét's death, it is necessary to consider his psychological profile and behavior before and after the incident, as well as the available physical evidence, or lack thereof. Prior to the murder, reports from the family's housekeeper, Linda Hoffman Pugh, and investigators such as Jim Clemente noted behaviors including Burke's scatological tendencies, such as leaving feces in JonBenét's bed and smearing it on her belongings. Some experts, like forensic pathologist Werner Spitz, interpreted this as possible indicators of psychological disturbance or sibling jealousy. In addition, Burke had a history of physical aggression, including striking JonBenét with a golf club, leaving a scar, suggesting impulsive behavior that could support an accidental killing theory. The 2016 CBS documentary proposed that a dispute over a late-night snack, possibly pineapple, could have escalated, leading Burke to strike JonBenét with a flashlight, causing the fatal skull fracture. This theory is supported by pineapple found in JonBenét's stomach and Burke's fingerprints on a bowl in the kitchen, suggesting they were together shortly before her death. However, the absence of Burke's DNA or fingerprints on the murder weapon, or the nylon cord used in the strangulation, combined with the presence of unidentified male DNA on JonBenét's clothing, as reported by sources like Eva VN and CBS News, strongly undermines claims of his direct involvement. In 1997 interviews with child psychologist Dr. Suzanne Bernhard, Burke displayed an unusual lack of visible emotion, and a sense of safety despite his sister's murder. While some, such as Clemente, found this suspicious, others, like behavioral expert David Thompson, attributed it to trauma or introversion. His 2016 Dr. Phil interview further fueled debate, with language analyst Mark McClish interpreting Burke's evasive phrasing and nervous laughter as potential signs of withholding information, though Thompson warned against equating these behaviors with guilt. The crime scene's complexity, including the sophisticated knots used in the strangulation and the staged ransom note, suggests a level of planning beyond the capacity of a 9-year-old, pointing toward possible adult involvement if Burke played any role at all. Intentional murder by Burke seems highly improbable given his age and lack of a clear motive, as noted by sources like Wikipedia. However, an accidental scenario remains possible but speculative in the absence of concrete evidence. The Ramsey family's consistent denials, their legal actions against CBS, and Burke's DNA exoneration, as reported in news outlets, further complicate the narrative. While Burke's behaviors raise questions, the lack of forensic evidence and the psychological complexity of a child in such a traumatic situation suggest that, if he was involved, it was likely accidental and would have required adult assistance to stage the scene, leaving the case unresolved as of July 18, 2025. Assessing whether a 9-year-old like Burke could independently commit the series of acts leading to JonBenét's death, as well as carry out the elaborate staging, requires examining multiple factors: psychological development, practical skills, ability to handle pressure, and social psychological influences. From a physical and motor skills perspective, causing severe injury with a heavy object and tying intricate nylon cord knots demands fine motor coordination and strength that experts agree is unlikely for a child under 10. Moreover, tasks such as managing the crime scene, positioning the body, writing a lengthy ransom note, and eliminating evidence require strategic thinking and an understanding of legal consequences, abilities far beyond those of most children. Psychologically, 9-year-olds typically lack the emotional regulation and complex reasoning skills of adults. Keeping such a major secret while coping with guilt, fear, or family pressure over time would require extraordinary maturity. If Burke had accidentally or intentionally caused his sister's death in a moment of anger or conflict, adult assistance would almost certainly have been needed to avoid legal repercussions, such as staging the scene, creating a ransom note, and fabricating evidence of sexual assault. These actions require legal awareness, psychological manipulation of investigators, and behavioral control, skills no 9-year-old could manage alone. Excluding Burke as the direct perpetrator raises the pressing question: who was the real killer? Burke witnessed certain truths. Following JonBenét's murder on December 25, 1996, he was interviewed multiple times by police and psychologists to gather insight into the tragedy. Key sessions included an interview with Detective Fred Patterson on December 26, 1996, just hours after her body was found, and another on January 8, 1997, with Dr. Suzanne Bernhard, a child psychologist retained by the Boulder Police Department. Additional interviews took place in 1997 and 1998 with experts such as Dr. John McCann. Dr. Bernhard's January 8, 1997 interview has been a focal point for case analysts. During this conversation, Burke was questioned about his knowledge of his sister's death. His responses, documented by James Kohler and others, sparked debate because of the details he mentioned and those he omitted. Burke's statement that he knew what happened initially seemed significant, but in context, it appears he was simply referring to knowing that his sister had been murdered and found in the basement, a fact his father had told him. When asked how he thought JonBenét died, Burke speculated that someone might have taken her to the basement and used a knife or hammer. These theories, particularly Burke's mention of a hammer, have drawn attention because JonBenét's autopsy revealed a severe head injury caused by a blow to the skull. However, Burke's failure to mention strangulation, a detail widely reported in the media by the time of the interview, puzzled investigators like James Kohler. By January 8, 1997, Boulder newspapers had published accounts of JonBenét's strangulation, making it common knowledge in the community. Kohler found it notable that Burke did not reference this during his conversation with Dr. Bernhard, raising questions about whether he was deliberately withholding information or simply unaware of the full extent of the injuries. The media's role in shaping Burke's knowledge is a critical point of contention. By early January, news outlets had extensively reported on JonBenét's death, including the fact that she was strangled. However, reports from January 6, 1997, also highlighted her head injury, specifically a skull fracture. This raises the possibility that Burke's reference to a hammer could have been influenced by these reports. Yet, his inclusion of a knife as a possible weapon complicates the picture. Initial media coverage had clearly stated that JonBenet was not stabbed, making Burke's speculation about a knife curious. Kohler questioned why Burke would combine these two methods, stabbing and striking, if he had accurate knowledge of his sister's injuries. One possibility is that Burke was merely guessing, piecing together fragments of information he had heard from adults, the media, or other sources. Children often process traumatic events through a mix of imagination and overheard details, which could explain his inconsistent narrative. Another theory suggests that Burke's speculations may have been influenced by unrelated cases or stories he had encountered. For instance, he might have overheard discussions about a 1984 Colorado killer who used both a knife and a hammer, and then conflated that with his sister's murder. This is purely speculative, but it illustrates how children can absorb and reinterpret information in unpredictable ways. Burke's age, 9 years old, further complicates the analysis. Young children are not typically avid consumers of news, and their understanding of events is often filtered through what they hear from adults or see in media. It's possible that his comments reflected a blend of what his father told him, what he picked up from news coverage, and his own attempts to make sense of an incomprehensible event. There has long been a narrative surrounding the Ramsey case that someone within the family might have been involved or at least knew more than they disclosed. But this interpretation assumes a level of calculation that may not align with how a 9-year-old processes trauma. Burke's mention of the head injury aligns with media reports, supporting the idea that he was repeating what he had heard. On the other hand, his failure to mention strangulation, despite its prominence in the news, could indicate either ignorance of the detail or an intentional omission, though the latter seems less likely given his age and emotional state. Interestingly, there is evidence that Burke was aware of the strangulation before his interview with Dr. Bernhard. Just days earlier, he had described the events to his friend Doug Stein in a way that reportedly alarmed his mother. This raises questions about why he omitted strangulation during the interview. One explanation could be that Burke was reluctant to discuss the more gruesome aspects of his sister's death, out of fear, confusion, or a desire to avoid the topic. Alternatively, his focus on the head injury and the knife could reflect the fragmented way children process information, especially under the stress of a formal interview. His inconsistencies, mentioning the head injury but not the strangulation, speculating about a knife despite media reports to the contrary, could simply indicate a young boy grappling with a tragedy beyond his comprehension. Another disturbing piece of evidence in the case is the flashlight found on the Ramsey family's kitchen counter, a black maglite. It was discovered in a conspicuously upright position amid a cluttered kitchen. What makes this flashlight particularly intriguing is the complete absence of fingerprints, not only on its exterior, but also on the batteries inside. Investigators noted that both the flashlight and its batteries appeared to have been deliberately wiped clean, raising suspicions of intentional misdirection. This lack of fingerprints is consistent with another major piece of evidence, the ransom note, which also bore no identifiable prints. suggesting that someone took deliberate steps to conceal their connection to these items. Initially, John and Patsy Ramsey seemed to recognize the flashlight, with Patsy vaguely recalling it as a gift from John's son, John Andrew, possibly for use in his plane or for other purposes. However, their story shifted over time, and they later claimed the flashlight did not belong to them. This contradiction is compounded by the fact that the drawer where John's flashlight was usually stored was found open with no flashlight inside, implying that their own flashlight may have been removed or replaced. The Ramseys' inconsistent statements, along with their insistence that the kitchen flashlight was foreign to their home, have fueled speculation that they were trying to distance themselves from the object, perhaps aware of its significance. The flashlight's placement, far from its usual storage spot near the bar area, adds another layer of mystery. Its prominent upright position seems almost designed to attract attention. Many investigators and analysts have theorized that the flashlight was intended to be seen as the possible murder weapon, capable of inflicting JonBenét's fatal head wound. Others argue it was a deliberate red herring meant to divert attention from the true weapon, possibly a softball bat linked to Patsy or Burke's recreational activities. The flashlight's location in the kitchen could have been a way to mislead investigators toward that part of the house and away from the basement where JonBenét's body was found. In law enforcement interviews, Patsy's responses about the flashlight were vague and contradictory. When shown a photo of it on the kitchen counter, she hesitated, uncertain whether it was theirs, even as she described a similar large black flashlight John owned. Her inability to definitively identify it, along with her remark about its usual storage in a drawer, contrasted with John's more deliberate responses. John acknowledged owning a similar mag light, but suggested it often didn't work due to dead batteries, further muddying the waters. This discrepancy, Patsy's apparent amnesia and John's selective clarity, raises questions about whether they were intentionally obscuring the flashlight's origin and purpose. Investigators, particularly Detective Haney of the Denver Police Department, who conducted Patsy Ramsey's June 1998 interview, also focused on two knives linked to Burke, not just the well-known red knife engraved with his name. Haney's questioning suggested that police were seeking evidence of a second knife separate from the Swiss-made Red Scout knife that John said he had purchased in Switzerland. Patsy seemed to recall only the engraved knife, vaguely mentioning a small keychain knife before quickly steering the conversation back to the red one. This shift in her account raised suspicions of possible evasion or selective memory. Burke, in contrast, openly acknowledged owning another knife, which he admitted using to make knots, a critical detail given the technical knots found at the crime scene involving JonBenét. According to the family's housekeeper, Linda Hoffman Pugh, the Red Scout knife, a typical Boy Scout multi-tool, was taken away from Burke after he was caught whittling recklessly. She hid it in a cupboard just outside JonBenét's room after Thanksgiving. Its location so close to the victim's bedroom suggested that anyone familiar with the house could have accessed it quickly, raising questions about who might have retrieved it and why. The Scout knife's association with knot-tying skills learned in the Boy Scouts further amplified its relevance, as the knots used to bind JonBenét were notably complex and not easily replicated. Patsy's responses during questioning only added to the uncertainty. When asked about a second knife, she deflected, claiming no memory of it, despite Burke's admission. Her vague mention of a keychain knife, followed by her emphasis on the Swiss knife, contrasted sharply with her reaction to a knife found in the basement near the crime scene, which she described as unusual, without explaining why. Patsy's awareness of the hidden knife near JonBenét's room made her surprise at the basement knife seem inconsistent. Her reluctance to acknowledge the second knife, along with her casual remark that she didn't know what to do except take it away, suggested she might have been withholding information. Hoffman Pugh's account added to this complexity. Frustrated by Patsy's lack of oversight, she hid the knife herself, noting Patsy's dismissive reaction. This raised a critical question. If the knife had been secured, how did it end up in the basement? One possibility was that the second knife, perhaps the one Burke used for knot tying, was the same knife found there, linking it directly to the murder's physical evidence. Burke's own admission that he used a knife to make knots stood out, especially since such skills, likely developed in Boy Scouts, matched the sophisticated knots on JonBenét. This contradicted Patsy's claim that Burke had no need for such a tool. The contrast between Burke's openness and Patsy's evasiveness fueled suspicion about what might have been concealed. Whether the second knife was the small keychain knife Patsy briefly mentioned, or a different tool entirely, its potential connection to the knots and its unexplained relocation to the basement underscored its significance in the investigation. The bowl of pineapple found on the dining table was another haunting clue. It bore both Burke's and Patsy's fingerprints, and pineapple was found in JonBenét's small intestine, meaning she ate it shortly before her death. This simple bowl of fruit became a focal point in Burke's June 1998 interview with Detective Dan Schuler, not only for its physical presence, but also for Burke's reaction when shown a photo of it. Instead of acknowledging the pineapple directly, Burke vaguely referred to the dining room table. He paused, let out a telling "oh," and appeared visibly uncomfortable, fidgeting, rubbing his arm, and giving a nervous chuckle. His reluctance to mention the pineapple suggested he understood its significance and may have been told to avoid it. The evidence implied that JonBenét and Burke were together at the table that night, contradicting his earlier claim that he last saw her asleep. This deliberate distancing, coupled with nervous behavior, pointed toward possible coaching, his 2016 doctor. Phil interview reinforced the pattern. He smiled inappropriately while discussing his sister's death, echoing his nervous laughter from 1998. One police theory suggested that JonBenét's eating the pineapple, possibly without permission, sparked a confrontation, trivial to an adult but significant to a child. Given the Ramseys' strong legal defense, Burke's 6-hour, 3-day interview, with attorney Jim Jenkins present, raised questions about whether his responses were rehearsed. Burke denied being coached, but the controlled interview environment, the Ramseys' legal strategy, and their reluctance to allow unmonitored questioning made that claim questionable. The FBI worried that allowing the family to be re-interviewed with attorneys present risked letting them tailor responses, a concern that extended to Burke. His consistent narrative that he slept through the events matched his parents' story almost too perfectly. Children can be coached to maintain such consistency, especially when protecting family. While it's possible Burke's defensiveness was simply the result of trauma, the careful orchestration of his interviews suggests he was likely briefed on how to answer sensitive questions. A child in such circumstances might instinctively avoid certain topics out of fear or confusion, even without explicit coaching. Yet the consistency of Burke's responses, the presence of legal counsel, and the Ramsey family's sophisticated defense strategy tilt the balance toward the likelihood of preparation. His guarded answers, combined with the family's efforts to control the investigative process, suggest a boy who was not only aware of the case's gravity, but was likely guided to present a version of events that protected the family's narrative. While definitive proof of coaching remains absent, the circumstantial evidence, his defensive demeanor, the controlled interview environment, and the Ramseys' legal maneuvering strongly points to Burke being prepared to navigate questioning carefully, ensuring his statements fit a carefully constructed defense. In the JonBenét Ramsey case, one controversial theory proposes that the events leading to her death could be linked to a playing doctor scenario involving her 9-year-old brother, Burke. Playing doctor is a term used for a common childhood behavior, typically occurring between ages 3 and 6, where children explore each other's bodies out of curiosity, often under the pretense of a doctor-patient game. In normal, consensual, age-appropriate contexts, this is considered a part of child development. However, the Ramsey case introduces a darker lens. What may have begun as innocent exploration could have escalated into something tragic. This theory is complicated by the violent nature of JonBenét's death and specific evidence, such as the paintbrush injury, which is far removed from harmless play. The idea stems from the close sibling relationship and moments of potential unsupervised interaction that night. Research, including Alfred Kinsey's 1948 study, notes that as many as 38.6% of children around age 10 have engaged in such exploratory behavior. In this hypothesis, Burke might have initiated such a game with his 6-year-old sister, unaware of the boundaries or consequences. But the use of the paintbrush in a way that caused severe injury indicates a deliberate act of harm, more akin to child-on-child sexual assault than innocent curiosity, raising questions about whether Burke's actions, if he was involved, were influenced by external factors or underlying psychological issues. Family dynamics and the pressures of the pageant world further complicate matters. As a child beauty queen, JonBenét was the center of attention, which could have caused feelings of jealousy or resentment in Burke, who may have felt overshadowed. Some speculate that a playing doctor game could have been an attempt to assert control or satisfy curiosity, but the escalation to violence, the paintbrush injury and fatal head blow, suggests something far more serious. There is no definitive evidence proving that Burke and JonBenét engaged in such play that night. Still, the family's guarded interview responses fuel speculation. Burke's defensive demeanor during his 1998 interview, as noted by investigator Lauren Schiller, could reflect discomfort with topics about his sister's body or interactions, or simply the natural anxiety of a child under investigation. Another troubling layer emerges with the theory that Burke himself may have been a victim of abuse. Behavioral and medical indicators in both Burke and JonBenét raise this possibility. Reports of Burke smearing feces, for example, align with behaviors seen in children who have experienced severe trauma or abuse, nonverbal expressions of distress in those unable to articulate their emotions. JonBenét's persistent bedwetting, encopresis, and recurrent vaginal infections, combined with Burke's behaviors, present a pattern that experts consider statistically alarming and unlikely to be coincidental. The Ramsey family's strict protection of Burke's medical records, especially unusual given his age, further fuels speculation. Such secrecy suggests those records may contain sensitive information, signs of trauma, behavioral diagnoses, or therapy records that could explain his actions or possible victimization. The family's legal team may have fought to keep these records sealed to avoid fueling a narrative that Burke was a troubled child capable of harming his sister. At the same time, they may have feared the records could reveal that he had been a victim himself, which would point toward a perpetrator within or close to the family. A related hypothesis positions Burke as a pivotal but unintentional player in JonBenét's death. According to this scenario, the night began normally after the family returned from a Christmas party. Burke, restless and eager to play, went downstairs for pineapple, later found in a bowl with both his and Patsy's fingerprints. JonBenét joined him, and after a moment together, the interaction turned sour. Possibly irritated while playing with his trains, Burke, described as having behavioral issues linked to parental neglect, struck JonBenét with an object, perhaps a flashlight. The blow was not intended to kill, but left her unconscious. Terrified, Burke alerted his parents. From there, the cover-up began. John Ramsey, fearing an autopsy would reveal prior abuse he had inflicted, took control to protect himself, crafting a plan that involved staging the scene and framing Patsy. Burke was told to stay in his room, keeping his involvement minimal and his alibi simple, that he was asleep. This was easy for a child to maintain, required little coaching, and matched the family's narrative. In this version, Burke's role ends after the initial blow. His impulsive act, driven by frustration rather than malice, set off a chain of events his father then manipulated for self-protection. Burke's nervous reaction when shown the pineapple photo in 1998 suggests awareness of what happened, even if he was instructed to deny involvement. Ultimately, this theory frames Burke as both a troubled child and a pawn, his actions sparking a tragedy that was then shaped by adult calculation. The sealed medical records could hold vital answers, yet their contents remain hidden. Without concrete evidence, every theory, whether of Burke's direct involvement, John Ramsey's manipulation, or external abuse, remains speculation. The case stands as a reminder of the dangers of premature judgment, underscoring the need for empathy toward those entangled in unresolved grief.